Basic North American technology. Basic North American software technology. Basic North American firmware technology. Basic North American freeware technology. Basic North American shareware technology. Basic North American middleware technology. Basic North American hardware technology. Intermediate North American technology. Intermediate North American software technology. Intermediate North American firmware technology. Intermediate North American freeware technology. Intermediate North American shareware technology. Intermediate North American middleware technology. Intermediate North American hardware technology. Advanced North American technology. Advanced North American software technology. Advanced North American firmware technology. Advanced North American freeware technology. Advanced North American shareware technology. Advanced North American middleware technology. Advanced North American hardware technology. Cutting-edge North American technology. Cutting-edge North American software technology. Cutting-edge North American firmware technology. Cutting-edge North American freeware technology. Cutting-edge North American shareware technology. Cutting-edge North American middleware technology. Cutting-edge North American hardware technology. State-of-the-art North American technology. State-of-the-art North American software technology. State-of-the-art North American firmware technology. State-of-the-art North American freeware technology. State-of-the-art North American shareware technology. State-of-the-art North American middleware technology. State-of-the-art North American hardware technology. Past North American technology. Past North American software technology. Past North American firmware technology. Past North American freeware technology. Past North American shareware technology. Past North American middleware technology. Past North American hardware technology. Present North American technology. Present North American software technology. Present North American firmware technology. Present North American freeware technology. Present North American shareware technology. Present North American middleware technology. Present North American hardware technology. Future North American technology. Future North American software technology. Future North American firmware technology. Future North American freeware technology. Future North American shareware technology. Future North American middleware technology. Future North American hardware technology. Basic North American technologies. Basic North American software technologies. Basic North American firmware technologies. Basic North American freeware technologies. Basic North American shareware technologies. Basic North American middleware technologies. Basic North American hardware technologies. Intermediate North American technologies. Intermediate North American software technologies. Intermediate North American firmware technologies. Intermediate North American freeware technologies. Intermediate North American shareware technologies. Intermediate North American middleware technologies. Intermediate North American hardware technologies. Advanced North American technologies. Advanced North American software technologies. Advanced North American firmware technologies. Advanced North American freeware technologies. Advanced North American shareware technologies. Advanced North American middleware technologies. Advanced North American hardware technologies. Cutting-edge North American technologies. Cutting-edge North American software technologies. Cutting-edge North American firmware technologies. Cutting-edge North American freeware technologies. Cutting-edge North American shareware technologies. Cutting-edge North American middleware technologies. Cutting-edge North American hardware technologies. State-of-the-art North American technologies. State-of-the-art North American software technologies. State-of-the-art North American firmware technologies. State-of-the-art North American freeware technologies. State-of-the-art North American shareware technologies. State-of-the-art North American middleware technologies. State-of-the-art North American hardware technologies. Past North American technologies. Past North American software technologies. Past North American firmware technologies. Past North American freeware technologies. Past North American shareware technologies. Past North American middleware technologies. Past North American hardware technologies. Present North American technologies. Present North American software technologies. Present North American firmware technologies. Present North American freeware technologies. Present North American shareware technologies. Present North American middleware technologies. Present North American hardware technologies. Future North American technologies. future North American software technologies, future North American firmware technologies, future North American freeware technologies, future North American shareware technologies, future North American middleware technologies, future North American hardware technologies, basic South American technology, basic South American software technology, basic South American firmware technology, basic South American freeware technology, basic South American shareware technology, basic South American middleware technology, basic South American hardware technology, intermediate South American technology, intermediate South American software technology, intermediate South American firmware technology, intermediate South American freeware technology, intermediate South American shareware technology, intermediate South American middleware technology, intermediate South American hardware technology, advanced South American technology, advanced South American software technology, advanced South American firmware technology, advanced South American freeware technology, advanced South American shareware technology, advanced South American middleware technology, advanced South American hardware technology, cutting-edge South American technology, cutting-edge South American software technology, cutting-edge South American firmware technology, cutting-edge South American freeware technology, cutting-edge South American shareware technology, cutting-edge South American middleware technology, cutting-edge South American hardware technology, state-of-the-art South American technology, state-of-the-art South American software technology, state-of-the-art South American firmware technology, state-of-the-art South American freeware technology, state-of-the-art South American shareware technology, state-of-the-art South American middleware technology, state-of-the-art South American hardware technology, past South American technology, past South American software technology, past South American firmware technology, past South American freeware technology, past South American shareware technology, past South American middleware technology, past South American hardware technology, present South American technology, present South American software technology, present South American firmware technology, present South American freeware technology, present South American shareware technology, present South American middleware technology, present South American hardware technology, future South American technology, future South American software technology, future South American firmware technology, future South American freeware technology, future South American shareware technology, future South American middleware technology, future South American hardware technology, basic South American technologies, basic South American software technologies, basic South American firmware technologies, basic South American freeware technologies, basic South American shareware technologies, basic South American middleware technologies, basic South American hardware technologies, intermediate South American technologies, intermediate South American software technologies, intermediate South American firmware technologies, intermediate South American freeware technologies, intermediate South American shareware technologies, intermediate South American middleware technologies, intermediate South American hardware technologies, advanced South American technologies, advanced South American software technologies, advanced South American firmware technologies, advanced South American freeware technologies, advanced South American shareware technologies, advanced South American middleware technologies, advanced South American hardware technologies, cutting-edge South American technologies, cutting-edge South American software technologies, cutting-edge South American firmware technologies, cutting-edge South American freeware technologies, cutting-edge South American shareware technologies, cutting-edge South American middleware technologies, cutting-edge South American hardware technologies, state-of-the-art South American technologies, state-of-the-art South American software technologies, state-of-the-art South American firmware technologies, state-of-the-art South American freeware technologies, state-of-the-art South American shareware technologies, state-of-the-art South American middleware technologies, state-of-the-art South American hardware technologies, past South American technologies, past South American software technologies, past South American firmware technologies, past South American freeware technologies, past South American shareware technologies, past South American middleware technologies, past South American hardware technologies, present South American technologies, present South American software technologies, present South American firmware technologies, present South American freeware technologies, present South American shareware technologies, present South American middleware technologies, present South American hardware technologies, future South American technologies, future South American software technologies, future South American firmware technologies, future South American freeware technologies, future South American shareware technologies, future South American middleware technologies, future South American hardware technologies, basic Central American technology, basic Central American software technology, basic Central American firmware technology, basic Central American freeware technology, basic Central American shareware technology, basic Central American middleware technology, basic Central American hardware technology, intermediate Central American technology, intermediate Central American software technology, intermediate Central American firmware technology, intermediate Central American freeware technology, intermediate Central American shareware technology, intermediate Central American middleware technology, intermediate Central American hardware technology, advanced Central American technology, advanced Central American software technology, advanced Central American firmware technology, advanced Central American freeware technology, advanced Central American shareware technology, advanced Central American middleware technology, advanced Central American hardware technology, cutting-edge Central American technology, cutting-edge Central American software technology, cutting-edge Central American firmware technology, cutting-edge Central American freeware technology, cutting-edge Central American shareware technology, cutting-edge Central American middleware technology, cutting-edge Central American hardware technology, state-of-the-art Central American technology, state-of-the-art Central American software technology, state-of-the-art Central American firmware technology, state-of-the-art Central American freeware technology, state-of-the-art Central American shareware technology, state-of-the-art Central American middleware technology, state-of-the-art Central American hardware technology, past Central American technology, past Central American software technology, past Central American firmware technology, past Central American freeware technology, past Central American shareware technology, past Central American middleware technology, past Central American hardware technology, present Central American technology, present Central American software technology, present Central American firmware technology, present Central American freeware technology, present Central American shareware technology, present Central American middleware technology, present Central American hardware technology, future Central American technology, future Central American software technology, future Central American firmware technology, future Central American freeware technology, future Central American shareware technology, future Central American middleware technology, future Central American hardware technology, basic Central American technologies, basic Central American software technologies, basic Central American firmware technologies, basic Central American freeware technologies, basic Central American shareware technologies, basic Central American middleware technologies, basic Central American hardware technologies, intermediate Central American technologies, intermediate Central American software technologies, intermediate Central American firmware technologies, intermediate Central American freeware technologies, intermediate Central American shareware technologies, intermediate Central American middleware technologies, intermediate Central American hardware technologies, advanced Central American technologies, advanced Central American software technologies, advanced Central American firmware technologies, advanced Central American freeware technologies, advanced Central American shareware technologies, advanced Central American middleware technologies, advanced Central American hardware technologies, cutting-edge Central American technologies, cutting-edge Central American software technologies, cutting-edge Central American firmware technologies, cutting-edge Central American freeware technologies, cutting-edge Central American shareware technologies, cutting-edge Central American middleware technologies, cutting-edge Central American hardware technologies, state-of-the-art Central American technologies, state-of-the-art Central American software technologies, state-of-the-art Central American firmware technologies, state-of-the-art Central American freeware technologies, state-of-the-art Central American shareware technologies, state-of-the-art Central American middleware technologies, state-of-the-art Central American hardware technologies, past Central American technologies, past Central American software technologies, past Central American firmware technologies, past Central American freeware technologies, past Central American shareware technologies, past Central American middleware technologies, past Central American hardware technologies, present Central American technologies, present Central American software technologies, present Central American firmware technologies, present Central American freeware technologies, present Central American shareware technologies, present Central American middleware technologies, present Central American hardware technologies, future Central American technologies, future Central American software technologies, future Central American firmware technologies, future Central American freeware technologies, future Central American shareware technologies, future Central American middleware technologies, future Central American hardware technologies, basic European technology, basic European software technology, basic European firmware technology, basic European freeware technology, basic European shareware technology, basic European middleware technology, basic European hardware technology, intermediate European technology, intermediate European software technology, intermediate European firmware technology, intermediate European freeware technology, intermediate European shareware technology, intermediate European middleware technology, intermediate European hardware technology, advanced European technology, advanced European software technology, advanced European firmware technology, advanced European freeware technology, advanced European shareware technology, advanced European middleware technology, advanced European hardware technology, cutting-edge European technology, cutting-edge European software technology, cutting-edge European firmware technology, cutting-edge European freeware technology, cutting-edge European shareware technology, cutting-edge European middleware technology, cutting-edge European hardware technology, state-of-the-art European technology, state-of-the-art European software technology, state-of-the-art European firmware technology, state-of-the-art European freeware technology, state-of-the-art European shareware technology, state-of-the-art European middleware technology, state-of-the-art European hardware technology, past European technology, past European software technology, past European firmware technology, past European freeware technology, past European shareware technology, past European middleware technology, past European hardware technology, present European technology, present European software technology, present European firmware technology, present European freeware technology, present European shareware technology, present European middleware technology, present European hardware technology, future European technology, future European software technology, future European firmware technology, future European freeware technology, future European shareware technology, future European middleware technology, future European hardware technology, basic European technologies, basic European software technologies, basic European firmware technologies, basic European freeware technologies, basic European shareware technologies, basic European middleware technologies, basic European hardware technologies, intermediate European technologies, intermediate European software technologies, intermediate European firmware technologies, intermediate European freeware technologies, intermediate European shareware technologies, intermediate European middleware technologies, intermediate European hardware technologies, advanced European technologies, advanced European software technologies, advanced European firmware technologies, advanced European freeware technologies, advanced European shareware technologies, advanced European middleware technologies, advanced European hardware technologies, cutting-edge European technologies, cutting-edge European software technologies, cutting-edge European firmware technologies, cutting-edge European freeware technologies, cutting-edge European shareware technologies, cutting-edge European middleware technologies, cutting-edge European hardware technologies, state-of-the-art European technologies, state-of-the-art European software technologies, state-of-the-art European firmware technologies, state-of-the-art European freeware technologies, state-of-the-art European shareware technologies, state-of-the-art European middleware technologies, state-of-the-art European hardware technologies, past European technologies, past European software technologies, past European firmware technologies, past European freeware technologies, past European shareware technologies, past European middleware technologies, past European hardware technologies, present European technologies, present European software technologies, present European firmware technologies, present European freeware technologies, present European shareware technologies, present European middleware technologies, present European hardware technologies, future European technologies, future European software technologies, future European firmware technologies, future European freeware technologies, future European shareware technologies, future European middleware technologies, future European hardware technologies, basic Asian technology, basic Asian software technology, basic Asian firmware technology, basic Asian freeware technology, basic Asian shareware technology, basic Asian middleware technology, basic Asian hardware technology, intermediate Asian technology, intermediate Asian software technology, intermediate Asian firmware technology, intermediate Asian freeware technology, intermediate Asian shareware technology, intermediate Asian middleware technology, intermediate Asian hardware technology, advanced Asian technology, advanced Asian software technology, advanced Asian firmware technology, advanced Asian freeware technology, advanced Asian shareware technology, advanced Asian middleware technology, advanced Asian hardware technology, cutting-edge Asian technology, cutting-edge Asian software technology, cutting-edge Asian firmware technology, cutting-edge Asian freeware technology, cutting-edge Asian shareware technology, cutting-edge Asian middleware technology, cutting-edge Asian hardware technology, state-of-the-art Asian technology, state-of-the-art Asian software technology, state-of-the-art Asian firmware technology, state-of-the-art Asian freeware technology, state-of-the-art Asian shareware technology, state-of-the-art Asian middleware technology, state-of-the-art Asian hardware technology, past Asian technology, past Asian software technology, past Asian firmware technology, past Asian freeware technology, past Asian shareware technology, past Asian middleware technology, past Asian hardware technology, present Asian technology, present Asian software technology, present Asian firmware technology, present Asian freeware technology, present Asian shareware technology, present Asian middleware technology, present Asian hardware technology, future Asian technology, future Asian software technology, future Asian firmware technology, future Asian freeware technology, future Asian shareware technology, future Asian middleware technology, future Asian hardware technology, basic Asian technologies, basic Asian software technologies, basic Asian firmware technologies, basic Asian freeware technologies, basic Asian shareware technologies, basic Asian middleware technologies, basic Asian hardware technologies, intermediate Asian technologies, intermediate Asian software technologies, intermediate Asian firmware technologies, intermediate Asian freeware technologies, intermediate Asian shareware technologies, intermediate Asian middleware technologies, intermediate Asian hardware technologies, advanced Asian technologies, advanced Asian software technologies, advanced Asian firmware technologies, advanced Asian freeware technologies, advanced Asian shareware technologies, advanced Asian middleware technologies, advanced Asian hardware technologies, cutting-edge Asian technologies, cutting-edge Asian software technologies, cutting-edge Asian firmware technologies, cutting-edge Asian freeware technologies, cutting-edge Asian shareware technologies, cutting-edge Asian middleware technologies, cutting-edge Asian hardware technologies, state-of-the-art Asian technologies, state-of-the-art Asian software technologies, state-of-the-art Asian firmware technologies, state-of-the-art Asian freeware technologies, state-of-the-art Asian shareware technologies, state-of-the-art Asian middleware technologies, state-of-the-art Asian hardware technologies, past Asian technologies, past Asian software technologies, past Asian firmware technologies, past Asian freeware technologies, past Asian shareware technologies, past Asian middleware technologies, past Asian hardware technologies, present Asian technologies, present Asian software technologies, present Asian firmware technologies, present Asian freeware technologies, present Asian shareware technologies, present Asian middleware technologies, present Asian hardware technologies, future Asian technologies, future Asian software technologies, future Asian firmware technologies, future Asian freeware technologies, future Asian shareware technologies, future Asian middleware technologies, future Asian hardware technologies, basic African technology, basic African software technology, basic African firmware technology, basic African freeware technology, basic African shareware technology, basic African middleware technology, basic African hardware technology, intermediate African technology, intermediate African software technology, intermediate African firmware technology, intermediate African freeware technology, intermediate African shareware technology, intermediate African middleware technology, intermediate African hardware technology, advanced African technology, advanced African software technology, advanced African firmware technology, advanced African freeware technology, advanced African shareware technology, advanced African middleware technology, advanced African hardware technology, cutting-edge African technology, cutting-edge African software technology, cutting-edge African firmware technology, cutting-edge African freeware technology, cutting-edge African shareware technology, cutting-edge African middleware technology, cutting-edge African hardware technology, state-of-the-art African technology, state-of-the-art African software technology, state-of-the-art African firmware technology, state-of-the-art African freeware technology, state-of-the-art African shareware technology, state-of-the-art African middleware technology, state-of-the-art African hardware technology, past African technology, past African software technology, past African firmware technology, past African freeware technology, past African shareware technology, past African middleware technology, past African hardware technology, present African technology, present African software technology, present African firmware technology, present African freeware technology, present African shareware technology, present African middleware technology, present African hardware technology, future African technology, future African software technology, future African firmware technology, future African freeware technology, future African shareware technology, future African middleware technology, future African hardware technology, basic African technologies, basic African software technologies, basic African firmware technologies, basic African freeware technologies, basic African shareware technologies, basic African middleware technologies, basic African hardware technologies, intermediate African technologies, intermediate African software technologies, intermediate African firmware technologies, intermediate African freeware technologies, intermediate African shareware technologies, intermediate African middleware technologies, intermediate African hardware technologies, advanced African technologies, advanced African software technologies, advanced African firmware technologies, advanced African freeware technologies, advanced African shareware technologies, advanced African middleware technologies, advanced African hardware technologies, cutting-edge African technologies, cutting-edge African software technologies, cutting-edge African firmware technologies, cutting-edge African freeware technologies, cutting-edge African shareware technologies, cutting-edge African middleware technologies, cutting-edge African hardware technologies, state-of-the-art African technologies, state-of-the-art African software technologies, state-of-the-art African firmware technologies, state-of-the-art African freeware technologies, state-of-the-art African shareware technologies, state-of-the-art African middleware technologies, state-of-the-art African hardware technologies, past African technologies, past African software technologies, past African firmware technologies, past African freeware technologies, past African shareware technologies, past African middleware technologies, past African hardware technologies, present African technologies, present African software technologies, present African firmware technologies, present African freeware technologies, present African shareware technologies, present African middleware technologies, present African hardware technologies, future African technologies, future African software technologies, future African firmware technologies, future African freeware technologies, future African shareware technologies, future African middleware technologies, future African hardware technologies, basic Middle Eastern technology, basic Middle Eastern software technology, basic Middle Eastern firmware technology, basic Middle Eastern freeware technology, basic Middle Eastern shareware technology, basic Middle Eastern middleware technology, basic Middle Eastern hardware technology, intermediate Middle Eastern technology, intermediate Middle Eastern software technology, intermediate Middle Eastern firmware technology, intermediate Middle Eastern freeware technology, intermediate Middle Eastern shareware technology, intermediate Middle Eastern middleware technology, intermediate Middle Eastern hardware technology, advanced Middle Eastern technology, advanced Middle Eastern software technology, advanced Middle Eastern firmware technology, advanced Middle Eastern freeware technology, advanced Middle Eastern shareware technology, advanced Middle Eastern middleware technology, advanced Middle Eastern hardware technology, cutting-edge Middle Eastern technology, cutting-edge Middle Eastern software technology, cutting-edge Middle Eastern firmware technology, cutting-edge Middle Eastern freeware technology, cutting-edge Middle Eastern shareware technology, cutting-edge Middle Eastern middleware technology, cutting-edge Middle Eastern hardware technology, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern technology, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern software technology, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern firmware technology, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern freeware technology, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern shareware technology, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern middleware technology, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern hardware technology, past Middle Eastern technology, past Middle Eastern software technology, past Middle Eastern firmware technology, past Middle Eastern freeware technology, past Middle Eastern shareware technology, past Middle Eastern middleware technology, past Middle Eastern hardware technology, present Middle Eastern technology, present Middle Eastern software technology, present Middle Eastern firmware technology, present Middle Eastern freeware technology, present Middle Eastern shareware technology, present Middle Eastern middleware technology, present Middle Eastern hardware technology, future Middle Eastern technology, future Middle Eastern software technology, future Middle Eastern firmware technology, future Middle Eastern freeware technology, future Middle Eastern shareware technology, future Middle Eastern middleware technology, future Middle Eastern hardware technology, basic Middle Eastern technologies, basic Middle Eastern software technologies, basic Middle Eastern firmware technologies, basic Middle Eastern freeware technologies, basic Middle Eastern shareware technologies, basic Middle Eastern middleware technologies, basic Middle Eastern hardware technologies, intermediate Middle Eastern technologies, intermediate Middle Eastern software technologies, intermediate Middle Eastern firmware technologies, intermediate Middle Eastern freeware technologies, intermediate Middle Eastern shareware technologies, intermediate Middle Eastern middleware technologies, intermediate Middle Eastern hardware technologies, advanced Middle Eastern technologies, advanced Middle Eastern software technologies, advanced Middle Eastern firmware technologies, advanced Middle Eastern freeware technologies, advanced Middle Eastern shareware technologies, advanced Middle Eastern middleware technologies, advanced Middle Eastern hardware technologies, cutting-edge Middle Eastern technologies, cutting-edge Middle Eastern software technologies, cutting-edge Middle Eastern firmware technologies, cutting-edge Middle Eastern freeware technologies, cutting-edge Middle Eastern shareware technologies, cutting-edge Middle Eastern middleware technologies, cutting-edge Middle Eastern hardware technologies, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern technologies, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern software technologies, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern firmware technologies, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern freeware technologies, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern shareware technologies, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern middleware technologies, state-of-the-art Middle Eastern hardware technologies, past Middle Eastern technologies, past Middle Eastern software technologies, past Middle Eastern firmware technologies, past Middle Eastern freeware technologies, past Middle Eastern shareware technologies, past Middle Eastern middleware technologies, past Middle Eastern hardware technologies, present Middle Eastern technologies, present Middle Eastern software technologies, present Middle Eastern firmware technologies, present Middle Eastern freeware technologies, present Middle Eastern shareware technologies, present Middle Eastern middleware technologies, present Middle Eastern hardware technologies, future Middle Eastern technologies, future Middle Eastern software technologies, future Middle Eastern firmware technologies, future Middle Eastern freeware technologies, future Middle Eastern shareware technologies, future Middle Eastern middleware technologies, future Middle Eastern hardware technologies, basic Australian technology, basic Australian software technology, basic Australian firmware technology, basic Australian freeware technology, basic Australian shareware technology, basic Australian middleware technology, basic Australian hardware technology, intermediate Australian technology, intermediate Australian software technology, intermediate Australian firmware technology, intermediate Australian freeware technology, intermediate Australian shareware technology, intermediate Australian middleware technology, intermediate Australian hardware technology, advanced Australian technology, advanced Australian software technology, advanced Australian firmware technology, advanced Australian freeware technology, advanced Australian shareware technology, advanced Australian middleware technology, advanced Australian hardware technology, cutting-edge Australian technology, cutting-edge Australian software technology, cutting-edge Australian firmware technology, cutting-edge Australian freeware technology, cutting-edge Australian shareware technology, cutting-edge Australian middleware technology, cutting-edge Australian hardware technology, state-of-the-art Australian technology, state-of-the-art Australian software technology, state-of-the-art Australian firmware technology, state-of-the-art Australian freeware technology, state-of-the-art Australian shareware technology, state-of-the-art Australian middleware technology, state-of-the-art Australian hardware technology, past Australian technology, past Australian software technology, past Australian firmware technology, past Australian freeware technology, past Australian shareware technology, past Australian middleware technology, past Australian hardware technology, present Australian technology, present Australian software technology, present Australian firmware technology, present Australian freeware technology, present Australian shareware technology, present Australian middleware technology, present Australian hardware technology, future Australian technology, future Australian software technology, future Australian firmware technology, future Australian freeware technology, future Australian shareware technology, future Australian middleware technology, future Australian hardware technology, basic Australian technologies, basic Australian software technologies, basic Australian firmware technologies, basic Australian freeware technologies, basic Australian shareware technologies, basic Australian middleware technologies, basic Australian hardware technologies, intermediate Australian technologies, intermediate Australian software technologies, intermediate Australian firmware technologies, intermediate Australian freeware technologies, intermediate Australian shareware technologies, intermediate Australian middleware technologies, intermediate Australian hardware technologies, advanced Australian technologies, advanced Australian software technologies, advanced Australian firmware technologies, advanced Australian freeware technologies, advanced Australian shareware technologies, advanced Australian middleware technologies, advanced Australian hardware technologies, cutting-edge Australian technologies, cutting-edge Australian software technologies, cutting-edge Australian firmware technologies, cutting-edge Australian freeware technologies, cutting-edge Australian shareware technologies, cutting-edge Australian middleware technologies, cutting-edge Australian hardware technologies, state-of-the-art Australian technologies, state-of-the-art Australian software technologies, state-of-the-art Australian firmware technologies, state-of-the-art Australian freeware technologies, state-of-the-art Australian shareware technologies, state-of-the-art Australian middleware technologies, state-of-the-art Australian hardware technologies, past Australian technologies, past Australian software technologies, past Australian firmware technologies, past Australian freeware technologies, past Australian shareware technologies, past Australian middleware technologies, past Australian hardware technologies, present Australian technologies, present Australian software technologies, present Australian firmware technologies, present Australian freeware technologies, present Australian shareware technologies, present Australian middleware technologies, present Australian hardware technologies, future Australian technologies, future Australian software technologies, future Australian firmware technologies, future Australian freeware technologies, future Australian shareware technologies, future Australian middleware technologies, future Australian hardware technologies, basic Antarctican technology, basic Antarctican software technology, basic Antarctican firmware technology, basic Antarctican freeware technology, basic Antarctican shareware technology, basic Antarctican middleware technology, basic Antarctican hardware technology, intermediate Antarctican technology, intermediate Antarctican software technology, intermediate Antarctican firmware technology, intermediate Antarctican freeware technology, intermediate Antarctican shareware technology, intermediate Antarctican middleware technology, intermediate Antarctican hardware technology, advanced Antarctican technology, advanced Antarctican software technology, advanced Antarctican firmware technology, advanced Antarctican freeware technology, advanced Antarctican shareware technology, advanced Antarctican middleware technology, advanced Antarctican hardware technology, cutting-edge Antarctican technology, cutting-edge Antarctican software technology, cutting-edge Antarctican firmware technology, cutting-edge Antarctican freeware technology, cutting-edge Antarctican shareware technology, cutting-edge Antarctican middleware technology, cutting-edge Antarctican hardware technology, state-of-the-art Antarctican technology, state-of-the-art Antarctican software technology, state-of-the-art Antarctican firmware technology, state-of-the-art Antarctican freeware technology, state-of-the-art Antarctican shareware technology, state-of-the-art Antarctican middleware technology, state-of-the-art Antarctican hardware technology, past Antarctican technology, past Antarctican software technology, past Antarctican firmware technology, past Antarctican freeware technology, past Antarctican shareware technology, past Antarctican middleware technology, past Antarctican hardware technology, present Antarctican technology, present Antarctican software technology, present Antarctican firmware technology, present Antarctican freeware technology, present Antarctican shareware technology, present Antarctican middleware technology, present Antarctican hardware technology, future Antarctican technology, future Antarctican software technology, future Antarctican firmware technology, future Antarctican freeware technology, future Antarctican shareware technology, future Antarctican middleware technology, future Antarctican hardware technology, basic Antarctican technologies, basic Antarctican software technologies, basic Antarctican firmware technologies, basic Antarctican freeware technologies, basic Antarctican shareware technologies, basic Antarctican middleware technologies, basic Antarctican hardware technologies, intermediate Antarctican technologies, intermediate Antarctican software technologies, intermediate Antarctican firmware technologies, intermediate Antarctican freeware technologies, intermediate Antarctican shareware technologies, intermediate Antarctican middleware technologies, intermediate Antarctican hardware technologies, advanced Antarctican technologies, advanced Antarctican software technologies, advanced Antarctican firmware technologies, advanced Antarctican freeware technologies, advanced Antarctican shareware technologies, advanced Antarctican middleware technologies, advanced Antarctican hardware technologies, cutting-edge Antarctican technologies, cutting-edge Antarctican software technologies, cutting-edge Antarctican firmware technologies, cutting-edge Antarctican freeware technologies, cutting-edge Antarctican shareware technologies, cutting-edge Antarctican middleware technologies, cutting-edge Antarctican hardware technologies, state-of-the-art Antarctican technologies, state-of-the-art Antarctican software technologies, state-of-the-art Antarctican firmware technologies, state-of-the-art Antarctican freeware technologies, state-of-the-art Antarctican shareware technologies, state-of-the-art Antarctican middleware technologies, state-of-the-art Antarctican hardware technologies, past Antarctican technologies, past Antarctican software technologies, past Antarctican firmware technologies, past Antarctican freeware technologies, past Antarctican shareware technologies, past Antarctican middleware technologies, past Antarctican hardware technologies, present Antarctican technologies, present Antarctican software technologies, present Antarctic and firmware technologies, present Antarctic and freeware technologies, present Antarctic and shareware technologies, present Antarctic and middleware technologies, present Antarctic and hardware technologies, future Antarctic and technologies, future Antarctic and software technologies, future Antarctic and firmware technologies, future Antarctic and freeware technologies, future Antarctic and shareware technologies, future Antarctic and middleware technologies, future Antarctic and hardware technologies,